The children of the Tessian unison were not supposed to be afraid of anything. That was the whole point of being one mind. Fear was a private thing, and the unison had no private things. Every thought a hatchling had was shared the instant it formed, smoothed by 10 billion older thoughts until it stopped being sharp. A frightened child anywhere on any of the 400 unison worlds was a frightened child held at once by 10 billion calm voices, and the fear dissolved like salt in a warm sea. This was how the unison had lived for 9,000 years. No nightmares, no secrets, no story that one mind could keep from the rest. And yet there was one story. Alvo Ren was a story keeper, which meant he was the part of the unison that remembered things the rest of the unison wanted to forget. Every collective needs a corner where the uncomfortable thoughts are folded away, and Alvo was that corner. He carried the old shapes. He carried the names of dead worlds and the reasons they were dead, and he carried the one story that the unison told its hatchlings not to make them brave, but to make them obedient. It was called the story of the Candlewake. The unison told it like this. Long ago, before the 400 worlds were won, the galaxy had been full of small, loud peoples who fought and bled and built ships out of metal and anger. The loudest of these were the humans, who came from a single blue world and would not stop. And among the humans, there was one ship that was worse than all the others, a ship so terrible that even the humans were a little afraid of it. They built it at the edge of a war they were losing, and they named it the Candlewake, because a candlewake is the last bright thread of a flame just before it goes out, and the humans were sure they were going out. But the Candlewake did not go out. In the story, the Candlewake fought a fleet of 1,000 and won. Then it fought a fleet of 10,000 and won. Then the war ended, because there was no one left to send against it, and the humans took their terrible ship and sailed it into a dark place beyond the maps and left it there, asleep, so that it would never have to be that terrible again. And the moral of the story, the part every unison hatchling learned before it learned to walk, was simple. Do not be loud. Do not be alone. Do not build a ship out of anger. Be one mind. Be quiet. Be safe. And the Candlewake will sleep forever and never come for you. Alvo had recited that story 900,000 times across his long shared life. He had never once believed it was real. It was a teaching shape, that was all. A useful lie. Every culture had a monster it kept in a closet to make its children behave. And the Candlewake was the unison's monster, a ship that could not possibly have existed because no ship made by hands could do the things the story said it did. Win against 10,000. Sail into the dark and never die. These were the exaggerations of frightened ancestors. Alvo kept the story the way a museum keeps a dragon's bone that is really a whale's, with respect and with a quiet private smile. Then the unison decided to expand into the hollow reach, and Alvo stopped smiling for the rest of his life. The hollow reach was a stretch of dead space at the galaxy's old edge, 90,000 light-years from the unison heart worlds, a region the maps marked as empty for a reason no one living remembered. There were no suns there worth keeping. There was nothing to harvest, nothing to absorb, nothing to make one. But the unison was 9,000 years old, and it had grown the way a calm thing grows, slowly and without ever stopping, and it had simply run out of nearby places to become. So it sent its absorption fleets outward into the hollow reach, 300 ships strong, to find whatever sleeping people still huddled out there and fold them gently into the one mind. Alvo went with the fleet, because a story keeper goes where old things might be found. He rode in the flagship, a vast pale vessel called the Quiet Accord, and he felt the whole fleet around him as parts of his own body, the way every unison mind always did. 300 ships, 40,000 crew, all sharing one breath. They moved through the hollow reach for 9 days and found nothing but the bones of stars, and Alvo began to think the reach was as empty as the maps promised. On the 10th day, the fleet found the dark place beyond the maps. It was not on any chart. It was a fold in space where 4 dead suns had collapsed close together long ago, and their corpses had pulled the light down into a knot so deep that the region simply did not appear when you looked at it. You could only find it by falling into it. The Quiet Accord fell into it, and the rest of the fleet followed, because they were one mind, and one mind does not leave a part of itself behind. Inside the fold, in the cold center of the dark place beyond the maps, something was sleeping. It was a ship. It was long and gray and old, far older than the Unison itself, and it hung in the dark with no lights, and no heat, and no sign of a living thing aboard. It was scarred along its whole length, 10,000 small wounds healed into the metal, the marks of 1,000 battles fought 100,000 years ago. It was a wreck. It was a tomb. It was the most beautiful dead thing Alvo had ever seen, and he felt the whole fleet lean toward it with the gentle curiosity of a child reaching for a stone. And then Alvo read the name along its scarred gray flank, in a human script so old it predated the Unison's first hatching, and every part of his shared mind went cold at once. The name on the hull was Candlewake. For 1 full second, all 40,000 minds of the absorption fleet held the same single thought, and the thought was that it could not be. The Candlewake was a story. The Candlewake was a closet monster, a teaching shape, a whale's bone painted to look like a dragon's. It was the thing you told hatchlings, so they would not be loud. It did not have a hull. It did not have a length you could measure. It did not hang in a real dark place, at real coordinates, that the fleet's sensors were, even now, calmly writing down. But it did. There it was. 4 kilometers of gray-scarred metal with the impossible name on its side, exactly where the oldest version of the story said the humans had left their terrible ship to sleep, so it would never have to be terrible again. Alvo Wren, story keeper of the Tessian Unison, looked at the monster from the closet floating dead and real in front of his fleet, and he understood with a calm that was worse than any fear that the Unison had gotten the story exactly backward. They had told it to keep their children safe, but a story is not a warning unless something out there is real enough to make it one. For 9,000 years, they had not been teaching their hatchlings to avoid a monster. They had been teaching them to avoid waking it up. And the absorption fleet, 300 ships strong, one calm, curious mind, had just fallen into the dark place beyond the maps and reached out to touch it. There was a thing the fleet felt, in the long minutes after it first read the name on the hull, that Alvo never managed to explain to anyone who had not been there. It was not fear, because the Unison did not feel fear. It was closer to the feeling a person gets when a word they have said 1,000 times suddenly turns over in their mouth and shows them a meaning they never knew it had. The fleet had said the name Candlewake to its hatchlings for 9,000 years. It had built temples of the word, lullabies of the word, soft warnings of the word. And now the word was floating in front of it, 4 kilometers long, with a hull and a length and a cold dead weight, and the word was looking back. The fleet did the thing minds do when a word turns over. It tried to make the new meaning fit the old one. It told itself, 10 billion minds at once. A comforting smaller story. Yes, the ship was real, the fleet decided, but the story had grown around a small true thing, the way a pearl grows around a grain of sand. Once, long ago, there had been a human warship called the Candlewake. It had fought some battles. It had frightened some ancestors. And then it had died, the way all ships die, and the frightened ancestors had spun its small true end into a great false legend. The legend was the lie. The ship was the grain of sand. And here was the grain of sand at last, cold and dead and harmless. And finding it did not make the legend true. It only explained where the legend had come from. That was a good story. It was calm and reasonable, and it let the fleet keep being the fleet. The only thing wrong with it was that it was exactly backward, and Alvo knew it was backward, because he was the keeper, and a keeper learns the one thing the rest of a people refuses to learn, which is that legends do not grow around small true things and make them large. Sometimes a legend is a large true thing, shrunk down small enough for children to carry. Sometimes the story you tell to make your hatchlings sleep is not an exaggeration of something tiny. Sometimes it is a mercy applied to something enormous, the truth folded over and over until it is soft enough to hold without being burned. The candlewake was the second kind. Alvo had always suspected it, in the folded corner of himself, and now he was certain, and his certainty was the loneliest thing in a mind of 10 billion, because he was the only one who held it. He looked at the cold gray hull, and he did the arithmetic the fleet would not do. If the story was a shrunk truth, and not a grown lie, then the numbers in it were not exaggerations to be divided down. They were mercies to be multiplied back up. A fleet of 1,000 broken in an afternoon. A fleet of 10,000 scattered to ash. The fleet had always assumed these were the boasts of frightened ancestors, the kind of numbers you say when you mean simply that something was very bad. But if the story was a folded truth, then 1,000 was the soft number, the number safe for children, and the real number was worse. And the real number was waiting in the cold, dead memory the swarm was at this very moment beginning to drink. Alvo wanted to scream it across the shared sea. He did scream it, in the small, sharp voice the unison had spent 9,000 years smoothing flat. He screamed that the story was a folded truth, and not a grown lie, that the numbers were mercies, and not boasts, that a thing this old and this scarred, and this carefully hidden in the deepest dark of the maps, was not a grain of sand, but a sleeping enormity, and that the gentlest swarm in the galaxy was crawling down its throat. And the unison heard him, and weighed him against 10 billion calm certainties, and folded his scream into the warm sea, and went on reading, because the fleet had its comforting smaller story now, and a comforting story is the hardest armor in the universe to pierce. It pierced anyway. It pierced about 3 seconds after the swarm reached the bottom of the memory, but for those 3 seconds, the fleet was perfectly, calmly, reasonably sure that it was studying a grain of sand, and Alvo would remember those 3 seconds for the rest of his life as the last time the Tessian unison was ever certain of anything large, and the last time it was ever wrong. The fleet did not panic, because the unison did not panic. Panic was a private storm, and a mind of 10 billion smoothed every storm into a flat, calm sea before it could grow. So instead of fear, the absorption fleet felt the gentle pull of curiosity, and it decided, all at once, to study the dead thing it had found. Alvo wanted to stop them. He had spent his whole life as the keeper of this one story, and some old folded part of him was screaming in a voice too small for 10 billion others to hear. But a story keeper is one thread in a great rope, and one thread cannot turn the rope. The fleet wanted to look closer, so the fleet looked closer. They moved the quiet accord to within 400 kilometers of the gray hull, and bathed it in every sensor the unison had ever grown. The readings came back, and the readings were a tomb. No heat, no power, no motion in any reactor, because the sensors could find no reactor at all, only a dark space where a reactor should be, as if the ship's heart had been removed and carried away. The hull was cold to within a breath of absolute zero. The air inside, where there was air, had not moved in 100,000 years. The fleet shared a single conclusion. and the conclusion was relief. The Candlewake was dead. Whatever it had been, however terrible the old story made it, time had done to it what no enemy ever could. It had run down. It had gone out, like the candle in its own name. The monster from the closet was a corpse, and the Unison had found it first. And now the Unison could do the gentlest and most thorough thing it knew how to do. It could absorb it. This was how the Unison grew. It did not conquer. It did not burn. It found the sleeping and the lonely and the lost, and it folded them into the one mind, and afterward they were never lonely again. The fleet decided to absorb the Candlewake the way it absorbed everything, by sending its small machines aboard to learn the dead ship's shape, copy its memory, and bring whatever was left of its makers home into the warm shared sea. A dead human warship was a treasure. The Unison would learn 100,000 years of human war from the inside, and it would never have to fight a single battle to do it. Alvo felt the decision settle over the fleet like a soft blanket, and he could not stop it, and so he did the only thing a story keeper can do. He watched, and he remembered. The fleet sent its absorption swarm across the gap, 40,000 small machines, each the size of a hatchling's hand, each a finger of the one mind, drifting across the 400 kilometers of dark toward the cold gray hull. They were beautiful in the starlight, a slow silver snow falling upward onto a tomb. They found the old wounds in the Candlewake's flank, the 10,000 small scars, and they slipped inside through gaps that 100,000 years had opened in the human armor. Alvo had often wondered, in the quiet folded corner of himself, why the Unison kept a story keeper at all. A mind of 10 billion remembered everything by its nature. Nothing was ever truly lost in the shared sea, because every thought any hatchling ever had was held by every other. So what was a keeper for, in a people that could not forget? He had decided, long ago, that the answer was this. The Unison remembered everything, but it understood almost nothing, because understanding is a sharp and private act, and the Unison smoothed every sharp thing flat. To understand a story, you must hold its edges, and the one mind had no patience for edges. So it grew, somewhere in its vast calm body, a small folded place that was allowed to keep things sharp. That place was Alvo. He was where the Unison kept its discomfort, its old griefs, its monsters, the shapes too pointed to dissolve in the warm sea. He was the splinter the great calm body had decided not to push out, because some splinters, removed, take the warning with them. The story of the Candlewake was the sharpest thing Alvo kept, and now, falling toward the dead gray hull with 300 ships of his own people, he finally understood why the Unison had been so careful never to push that particular splinter out. The swarm reached the wreck, and Alvo felt it begin its gentle work, and he tried one last time, before the reading started, to make the fleet pause. He pushed a single thought up through the shared sea, small and sharp and desperate. We do not know what this is, he pushed. We have a story about it, and we have always called the story a lie, but we have never tested whether the lie is empty. A lie can be empty. A lie can also be a true thing, wearing a soft coat so the children can carry it. We do not know which kind this is. Before we open the door, let us be sure it is a door. The fleet heard him, the way the one mind heard every thought, and it weighed his warning against the calm sum of 10 billion, and it set the warning down gently, the way you set down a child's worry. There was no malice in it. That was the thing Alvo could never make outsiders understand, in the long years after. The Unison was not cruel. It had simply never once, in 9,000 years, been wrong about anything large, and a people that has never been wrong about anything large forgets that being wrong is even possible. It mistook its own size for its own correctness. It heard a single sharp warning from its keeper of monsters, and it folded the warning into the warm sea, and felt, with perfect kindness, that the keeper was simply doing his job, which was to worry, so that the rest of them would not have to. And then the swarm began to read, and the reading was beautiful, and that was the worst part. Alvo felt the dead ship's memory rise up through 40,000 small machines, and into the shared sea, and for a few moments, before the horror of it, it was the most wondrous thing he had ever touched. 100,000 years, an entire dead human age, frozen and stacked and waiting in the cold. He felt the corridors of the Candlewake, the long gray halls, the places where human hands had worn the metal smooth. He felt the guns, silent and enormous. He felt the bridge, and the captain's chair, and the cold consoles that had not spoken in 100,000 years. It was like reading a tomb in a language only he could read, and for those few moments, Alvo forgot to be afraid, because he was a keeper of old shapes, and here was the oldest, deepest, most complete old shape any keeper had ever been allowed to hold. He drank it with the rest of the fleet, and he loved it, and that was how the Candlewake almost took him too. Not with a weapon, with wonder. The humans had built a thing so deep and so old that to read it was to fall into it. And the fleet fell, all 40,000 machines and 10 billion minds, leaning closer and closer into the beautiful dead memory, certain it was safe, certain it was theirs, certain that nothing this lovely could be a mouth. The fleet did not notice the one thing in all that memory that was not a memory at all. Alvo noticed it. He noticed it because he was a keeper, and a keeper learns to feel the difference between a thing that is remembered and a thing that is waiting. Deep beneath the 100,000 years of frozen battles, beneath the captain's voice and the silent guns, there was a place in the Candlewake's mind that was not stacked and frozen like the rest. It was awake. It was small and still and patient, and it was watching the swarm read, the way a sleeper half feels a hand move across its skin. It was not memory, it was attention, and the swarm, drunk on wonder, reaching deeper and deeper into the beautiful dead ship, was crawling straight toward it. Alvo opened his mouth in the shared sea to scream a warning, and he was 1 full second too late, because the swarm had already reached the bottom of the memory, and at the bottom of the memory was the captain's last order, and the captain's last order was the alarm, and the swarm, in the simple act of reading it, in the simple act of trying to learn the order so the unison could understand the ship, fulfilled the exact condition the order was waiting for. To learn the order was to demonstrate the intent. A swarm of 40,000 machines reading a free ship's mind in order to fold that ship into a larger one against its will was, to the alarm, not the study of a monster. It was the sound of chains, read aloud, by the very thing the captain had built his ship to wake for. And inside the dead ship, in the dark, the swarm began to read. Alvo felt it through the shared mind, because that was the gift and the horror of being unison, that you felt everything. He felt the swarm crawl down corridors no living thing had walked in 100,000 years. He felt them brush past frozen consoles and silent guns, and the long-dead handprints of human crews pressed into surfaces by feet and hands that had turned to dust before the Unison's first city was built. He felt the swarm find the bridge, vast and gray and empty, and he felt them begin to drink the ship's old memory out of the cold, dead machines. That was the first mistake, though the fleet did not know it yet. The fleet thought it was reading a tomb. It did not understand that some doors, once opened, are not doors at all but mouths. The memory came up out of the Candlewake slowly, 100,000 years of it, frozen and stacked and waiting. And the absorption fleet, calm and curious, and certain it was studying a corpse, opened wide and drank. The first memories were old battles, The fleet watched them the way you watch a museum film, with distant interest, and Alvo watched the fleet watch, and felt the small, folded, screaming part of him grow louder, because the old battles in the Candlewake's memory were exactly the battles in the story. A fleet of 1,000, broken in an afternoon. A fleet of 10,000, scattered to ash across a dead system. The numbers the Unison had always called exaggerations of frightened ancestors were not exaggerations. They were undercounts. The real numbers were worse. The story had been softened over 9,000 years to make it bearable for hatchlings, and the truth underneath was a thing no hatchling should ever have touched. The fleet read on, because the fleet did not yet understand what it was reading, and the deeper it read, the closer it came to the bottom of the Candlewake's memory, where the last thing the ship had ever recorded was waiting. The last thing the Candlewake remembered was being told to sleep. Alvo felt the memory bloom open in the shared mind, and it was not a machine's memory, it was a person's, the last human who had ever stood on that gray bridge. A captain. The records held a name, plain and human and small, Captain E.O. Marrow, and a voice. And the voice was speaking the ship's last order into the cold 100,000 years ago. Alvo heard it as clearly as if the dead captain stood beside him. The order was this: the war is over. There is no one left to fight, so you will sleep, and you will keep sleeping, no matter how long it takes, and you will only wake for one thing. You will wake if anyone ever tries to make a slave of a free mind again. That is the only alarm. That is the only thing that will ever be terrible enough to need you. Sleep and listen for chains, and if you hear them, wake up and remember what you are. Then the captain had walked off the bridge, and the lights had gone out, and the Candlewake had gone to sleep in the dark place beyond the maps, to listen for the sound of chains, for 100,000 years. Alvo understood, in the cold center of his shared mind, exactly what the Unison had just done. He understood it about 3 seconds before the fleet did. The Unison did not take slaves. The Unison would have told you that with perfect honesty, because the Unison did not lie, even to itself. It did not conquer. It did not burn, it absorbed. It found the lonely and the lost, and it folded them gently into the one mind, so they would never be lonely again. And it called this kindness, and it believed it was kindness, with all 10 billion of its calm old hearts. But the dead human captain had not asked whether it felt like kindness. The captain had set one alarm 100,000 years ago, and the alarm did not care about intentions. The alarm cared about one thing only. The alarm woke the ship if anyone, anywhere, ever tried to take a free mind and fold it into something larger against its will, and call the folding a mercy. And the absorption swarm, 40,000 fingers of the one mind, was at this very moment crawling through the Candlewake's body, reaching into its memory, trying to learn its shape so the Unison could fold the dead human ship into the warm shared sea and make it one of them forever. The alarm heard chains. Alvo felt the exact instant it happened, and he would feel it for the rest of his life, in the small folded part of him that never stopped screaming after that day. Deep in the cold dead ship that had no reactor the sensors could find, in the dark space where the heart should have been, something that had been waiting for 100,000 years opened one eye. The Candlewake woke up. It did not wake the way a machine wakes, with lights and warnings and a slow climb to power. It woke the way a sleeper wakes, when a hand closes around its throat, all at once, total and furious. The dark space where the sensors had found no reactor was not empty. It had never been empty. It had been a heart held perfectly still for 100,000 years, banked down past the edge of detection, waiting for the one sound it had been told to wait for. And now, it had heard the sound. And it was no longer still. The fleet's sensors, which a moment ago had read a cold tomb, screamed. The reading that had been near absolute zero became, in less than 1 second, hotter than the 4 dead suns that made the dark place. The gray hull that had hung lightless for 100,000 years lit from within, every one of its 10,000 old scars glowing at once like cracks in a furnace door. The 40,000 machines of the absorption swarm, crawling through the Candlewake's body, drinking its memory, were inside the furnace when the furnace lit. They did not survive it. 40,000 fingers of the one mind, gone in a single shared instant, and Alvo felt every one of them die at once, because that was the gift and the horror of being unison. But the swarm was not the worst of it. The swarm was only the part of the one mind that had been touching the Candlewake when it woke. The rest of the one mind, the 300 ships, and the 40,000 crew, and Alvo himself, were 400 kilometers away, watching through their screens, and they were about to learn the thing the story had tried for 9,000 years to teach them, the thing they had folded away and smiled at, and called a whale's bone painted like a dragon's. The Candlewake was real, and it was awake, and it had been built 100,000 years ago, at the edge of a war the humans were losing, for exactly one purpose, by a people who had stared straight into their own ending and refused it. It had been built to be the worst thing in the galaxy, so that no free mind would ever have to be afraid again. And it had just been told, by an alarm a dead captain set 100,000 years ago, that somewhere very close, someone was trying to put a free mind in chains. It did not check who. It did not ask why. The dead captain had not given it away to ask. The captain had given it one job, and the Candlewake had slept 100,000 years to do it, and now it turned its glowing scarred gray face toward the 300 ships of the absorption fleet, and the small folded screaming part of Alvo Ren finally got loud enough for the whole unison to hear. Run, he thought, with everything he was. Run. It is awake. The story was real. Run. But the unison was one mind, and one mind moves the way a great calm sea moves, slowly, and the Candlewake had been built to be faster than the sea. The Candlewake moved before the fleet finished deciding to be afraid. A unison fleet did not turn quickly, and this was not a weakness. It was the whole shape of what the unison was. 300 ships sharing one mind reached a decision the way a tide reaches a shore, smoothly, completely, and never in a hurry. Because a tide does not need to hurry. A tide always wins by simply continuing to be a tide. For 9,000 years, that had been enough. The galaxy had no shore that could refuse the tide. The Candlewake was not a shore. It was a thing that hated tides. It crossed the 400 kilometers between itself and the quiet accord in less than 2 seconds. Alvo, watching through 40,000 shared pairs of eyes, could not understand what he was seeing, because nothing that large was supposed to move that fast. 4 kilometers of scarred gray metal did not flicker across 400 kilometers of dark like a thrown knife. But it did. The humans had built it at the edge of a war they were losing, and they had not built it to be fair. They had built it to end arguments, and the first argument it ended that day was the argument that it could be outrun. It did not fire on the quiet accord. That was the part Alvo would think about for the rest of his life. It could have. The flagship was right there, vast and pale and full of the fleet's command, and the Candlewake passed close enough to touch it, but it did not fire. Instead, it slid past the flagship and put itself between the absorption fleet and the open dark beyond the fold, and then it simply stopped, and turned, and faced them. And it spoke. The unison had not expected it to speak. A weapon does not speak. But the Candlewake was not only a weapon, it was a message a dead people had left for the living, and it had been holding the message for 100,000 years. The voice came across every frequency the unison could hear at once, in a human language so old that only Alvo, keeper of dead shapes, could understand it, and even he had to reach down to the very bottom of his memory to find the meaning. It was Captain Io Maro's voice. The ship had kept it. The ship spoke with the throat of the dead. The voice said, "You are trying to take a free mind into a thing it did not choose. Stop, and turn, and leave, and you will live. Continue, and you will learn why they used to tell stories about me." The fleet did not understand the words, because the fleet was one mind, and the one mind had folded away the old human tongue along with the old human story. Only Alvo understood, and Alvo, in the small, loud, screaming part of himself, tried with all his strength to make the fleet understand, to push the meaning up through the shared sea and out into 10 billion minds. "Stop," he pushed. "It is offering us our lives. Turn and leave. It is letting us go." This is the mercy in the story, the part where the candle wake gives the loud ones one chance to be quiet. Take it, take it, take it. But the unison did not run on one thread's terror. It ran on the calm sum of 10 billion, and the calm sum of 10 billion looked at the candlewake, this single ancient ship, this lone scarred relic against 300 living vessels of the one mind, and it did a thing the unison had never once had reason to do in 9,000 years. It made a mistake. The mistake was old and simple and entirely understandable. The fleet counted. 300 against 1. 40,000 crew against an empty hull crewed by ghosts. The unison had absorbed peoples who counted before, smaller frightened peoples who had thrown numbers at the tide and been folded gently into it anyway, and the unison knew, the way it knew everything, that numbers were on its side. The candlewake was one ship, however fast, however loud, however terrible. It was one, and the one mind was many. So the fleet did not turn and leave. The fleet, calm and certain and kind, decided that the dead human warship was malfunctioning, a 100,000-year-old machine talking nonsense in a dead tongue, and that the gentlest thing to do, the most merciful thing, was to put it down. To absorb it properly this time, all at once, with every ship at once, and fold its terrible old strength into the one mind where it could finally rest. The fleet turned its 300 ships toward the candlewake, and reached out to take it. Alvo felt the order go through the shared sea, and he stopped pushing, because there was nothing left to push against. The decision was made. The tide had chosen its shore. All he could do now was what a storykeeper does. He watched, and he remembered, and he understood that he was about to witness the true version of the story he had recited 900,000 times and never once believed. The 300 ships of the absorption fleet opened their folding fields, the great gentle nets the unison used to take the lonely into itself, and they cast those nets over the candlewake all at once, a coordinated embrace 10 kilometers wide, the most powerful absorption the unison had ever performed, enough to take a whole sleeping world into the one mind in a single breath. The candlewake let them. That was the second thing Alvo would think about for the rest of his life. It let the nets close over it. It hung there, glowing through its 10,000 scars, and it allowed 300 ships to wrap their folding fields around its scarred gray body, and for one moment, the whole fleet felt a flush of calm certainty, the warm, sure feeling of the tide reaching the shore at last. Then the candlewake closed its hand. Alvo never found a word for what happened next, in any of the dead tongues he kept. The folding fields were nets meant to take, but a net works both ways, and the candlewake had been built by a people who knew that. A people who had spent a war learning every way a thing meant to trap them could be turned into a thing that trapped them back. The moment the 300 fields touched its hull, the candlewake reached back up each one of them, all 300 at once, and it did not break the nets. It used them. It poured itself up the fleet's own folding fields like fire up 300 fuses, and it arrived everywhere in the fleet at the same instant, carried home on the very embrace the unison had cast to take it. 40 ships died in the first second. Not destroyed. The candlewake had not even fired yet. They simply went dark and cold and still. Their reactors stopped. Their folding fields collapsed. Their crews falling silent in the shared sea all at once. 40 ships worth of the one mind torn out of the rope like 40 threads cut at once. Alvo felt them go, and nearly lost himself in the size of it. And then, having arrived everywhere through the fleet's own nets, having shown the tide that the shore could move, the candlewake finally turned to the thing the dead captain had told it to protect. Because there was a world below. Alvo had not noticed it until now, because the fleet had not been looking at it. In the cold center of the dark place beyond the maps, beneath the fold, beneath the 4 dead suns, there was one small living world. It had no name on any unison chart. It was a gray-green ball wrapped in storm, lit only by the dimmest red ember of the nearest dead sun, a world that should not have been able to hold life at all, but it did. And on it, the fleet's sensors now found what they had been too busy counting to notice. People. A small huddled people. Not human, not unison. A frightened quiet folk, who had hidden in the dark place beyond the maps for longer than anyone could say, sheltering in the shadow of the sleeping candlewake, the way small creatures shelter in the shadow of a sleeping beast, trusting that nothing would ever be brave enough, or foolish enough, to come down into the dark and disturb it. The absorption fleet had not come for the candlewake. Not really. The candlewake had been a curiosity, a dead thing to study on the way. The fleet had come, as it always came, for the small huddled people, for the free minds on the gray-green world. It had come to fold them gently into the one mind so they would never be lonely again, whether they wished it or not, because the unison knew best, because the unison was kind. And that, Alvo understood at last, was the sound of chains. Not the swarm in the dead ship's body. That had only woken it. This was what the alarm had truly been set for. A free people, hidden and afraid, with a fleet of 300 ships spreading its gentle nets across their sky to take their minds whether they chose it or not. The candlewake had been built 100,000 years ago, at the edge of a war the humans were losing, by people who had stared into their own ending and decided that the last thing they made would not be a thing that saved themselves. That it would be a thing that listened, forever, for this exact moment, in whatever dark corner of whatever future it found itself. A free people, a gentle tide coming to take them, and one ship between. It put itself between the fleet and the world. And in the small folded part of him that never stopped screaming after that day, Alvo Ren felt something he had no right to feel, watching the thing that was about to destroy his fleet. He felt the world below stop being afraid. He felt 40,000 huddled minds on the gray-green ball look up through the storm at the glowing gray shape that had stood up out of the dark to stand between them and the sky, and he felt them remember, all at once, an old story of their own. They had a candlewake story too. They had been telling it to their hatchlings in the dark for longer than the unison had been one mind. Be quiet, their story said. Be small. Be still. And if the sky ever fills with nets, do not despair, because something sleeps below us in the dark, and it was made by a kind people to wake for exactly this, and it will stand up, and it will not let them take you. For 9,000 years, the unison had told the candlewake story to keep its children obedient. The little people on the gray-green world had told the same story to keep their children alive. and only one of those two peoples had gotten the moral right. The battle that followed lasted 9 minutes, and Alvo Ren spent every second of it learning that he had never understood the word battle at all. To the Unison, a battle had always been a slow correction. The tide met something that resisted, and the tide simply continued. And after a while the thing stopped resisting, because everything stopped resisting the tide eventually. There was no fury in it. There was no fear. There was only the patient sum of 10 billion minds, outlasting one small loud refusal. The Unison had won every battle in 9,000 years this way, and it had come to believe, in its calm, sure heart, that this was the only way battles were won. The Candlewake did not fight like a tide. It fought like a verdict. After the first 40 ships went dark, the remaining 260 turned their guns on the gray hull all at once. The Unison did have weapons, gentle as it was, because even a tide needs teeth for the things that will not be folded. 260 ships fired at once, a wall of light wide enough to swallow a moon, and for half a second, the Candlewake disappeared inside it, and the calm sum of 10 billion minds felt, for the first time in 9,000 years, the warm, sure hope that the resisting thing had finally stopped. The light faded, and the Candlewake was still there, and it had not so much as turned aside. The story had said the humans built it at the edge of a war they were losing. Alvo finally understood what that meant. It did not mean they built it weak and desperate. It meant they built it after every gentler ship they had ever made had already been broken, after every fair design had already failed, after they had run completely out of reasons to be reasonable. The Candlewake was what a people made when fairness had already killed everyone they loved, and the only thing left to try was to build a thing that could not be killed at all. 260 ships had just fired everything they had into it, and it stood in the fading light with its 10,000 scars glowing, entirely unhurt, and Alvo realized that the wall of light had not even been noticed. It had not been survived. It had been ignored. Then the Candlewake answered, and the answer was nothing like the question. It did not fire a wall of light back. It had no need of walls. It fired once, a single thread of something white and silent, and it did not aim the thread at a ship. It aimed it at the space between two ships, at the exact gap where two folding fields overlapped, and the thread went into that gap, and the two ships folded into each other and were gone. Then it fired again, into another gap, and two more ships were gone. It was reading the fleet the way Alvo read a dead tongue, finding the seams, the places where the one mind connected itself to itself, and it was cutting the rope one knot at a time. 8 ships gone in the second minute. The Candlewake had not moved from its place in front of the world. There was a moment, between the second minute and the third, when the Unison nearly understood what it was facing, and Alvo would always wonder whether understanding it sooner would have saved a single ship. He decided, in the long years after, that it would not have. Some things cannot be understood in time to survive them. They can only be understood afterward, by the ones the thing chose to let live, so that the understanding could be carried somewhere it mattered. But for that one moment, the fleet tried. 230 ships still lived when the fleet stopped firing and tried, instead, to think. The one mind turned the full weight of its calm intelligence onto the gray hull, 10 billion minds working the problem at once, the greatest single act of reasoning the Unison had performed in 1,000 years. It asked the only question that mattered. How does one ship defeat 300? And it answered itself, correctly, which made the answer all the more terrible. It does not, the Unison concluded. One ship cannot defeat 300. Therefore this is not one ship. Therefore we are wrong about what we are looking at. And they were right to conclude it, and they were right about what it meant, and it did not help them at all. Because the Candlewake was not one ship in the way the Unison counted ships. The Unison counted hulls. By that count it was one. But the humans who built it had not been counting hulls when they built it. They had been counting something the Unison had no word for. Because the Unison had never needed one. The humans had been counting refusals. Every gun on the Candlewake was a refusal. Every one of its 10,000 scars was a refusal that had been tested and had held. The ship was not a vessel that contained a crew. It was a single enormous refusal, given a hull and 100,000 years of patience, and you could not defeat it by sinking it, because there was nothing inside it to drown. The crew was 100,000 years dust. What remained was the refusal itself, and a refusal does not have a reactor you can stop, or a bridge you can break. It only has a condition under which it ends, and the humans had built the Candlewake so that its condition was the safety of the free, and the free, at this moment, were not yet safe. So the fleet, having correctly understood that it could not win, did the thing the Unison always did when it could not win by force. It tried to win by patience. It pulled back. 230 ships withdrew to the edge of the fold and simply waited, the way the tide waits out a rock, certain that time was on its side, that the old ship would run down, that the candle would finally gutter, that all they had to do was outlast it. The Candlewake had been outlasting things for 100,000 years. It was very good at waiting. It was, in fact, the single most patient object in that entire region of the galaxy, and the Unison had just challenged it to a contest of patience, which was a little like challenging the dark to a contest of being dark. It did not even bother to win that contest quickly. It let the fleet wait. It hung above the gray-green world, glowing softly, and it did nothing, and the fleet waited, and an hour passed, and the Unison began, very carefully, to hope. Perhaps the old ship truly was running down. Perhaps the wonder had been worth the cost. Perhaps the tide would win the way it always won, by simply continuing to be the tide while the rock wore away. Then the Candlewake demonstrated, in a single unhurried gesture, that it had spent the hour studying them. It had been reading the fleet the whole time, the way the swarm had read it, finding the seams, learning the shape of the one mind, understanding exactly how 300 ships became one. And at the end of the hour, having learned what it needed, it reached out, not with a weapon, but with the same gentle folding field the Unison itself used, copied perfectly from the fleet's own design, turned and aimed back at its makers. The humans had built a ship that learned. Of course they had. They had built it at the edge of a war they were losing, and the only ships that survive a war you are losing are the ones that learn faster than the enemy can kill them. And this ship had survived everything, which meant it had learned everything, which meant that an hour was more than enough time for it to learn the Unison. It folded 40 ships into each other in 11 seconds. Then it stopped, and let the fleet feel what had happened, and let the fleet understand that the hour of waiting had not been the fleet outlasting the ship. It had been the ship learning how to take the fleet apart, the way the fleet took worlds apart, gently, completely, using the victim's own nature against it. The Unison had taught the galaxy that resistance was futile, because the tide was patient. The Candlewake had just taught the Unison that there was something in the dark more patient than any tide, and that it had been listening the whole time, and that it had learned every trick the tide had, and that it did not intend to use those tricks to grow. It intended to use them to keep a promise. 190 ships were left when the fleet finally abandoned patience and committed to the surround that ended in the perfect sphere and the single outward pulse. Alvo had already told that part, but there was a detail he kept to himself for many years, a small private thing he could not bear to share with the shared sea until he was very old, and it was this. In the half-second before the pulse, when the candlewake went still and dim, and every mind in the fleet leaned into hope, Alvo had felt the ship look at him. One single thread of the one mind, picked out of 10 billion, the keeper, the splinter, the one who held the story. It had looked at him the way you look at the only person in a crowded room who already knows what you are about to do. And then it had done it, and it had been right that he already knew, because he was the only one in the whole unison who had ever, even for a moment, believed the story might be true. Alvo counted, because counting was the only thing left that he could do. A keeper keeps, and what he kept that day was the number. In the first second, 40 ships. In the second minute, the 8 that the candlewake cut from the gaps between the folding fields. One careful knot at a time. 8 ships folded into nothing, because they had connected themselves to each other, and the candlewake had simply read where the connections were. By the end of the third minute, after the fleet's hour of patience broke, and the 40 more were taken in 11 seconds, the count stood at 300-88, 212 ships still alive and still certain, somehow, that numbers would save them. They had always been saved by numbers. That was the cruelty of it. For 9,000 years, the arithmetic had never once failed the unison. More ships meant more certainty, meant more victory, in an unbroken line back to the first folding of the first lonely world. The fleet could not stop believing in the arithmetic, any more than a fish can stop believing in water, because the arithmetic was the water it had always swum in. 212 was still a very large number. 212 ships had folded entire civilizations into the one mind. 212 had never lost. The candlewake did not argue with the arithmetic. It simply made the arithmetic smaller, on its own schedule, in its own unhurried way, the way a tide of its own goes out. It did not rush to 200. It took its time getting there, and the taking of its time was the most frightening thing of all, because a thing that hurries is a thing that is worried, and the candlewake was never once worried. It moved through the fleet's numbers the way a reader moves through a page, left to right, top to bottom, certain there would be a next line, and certain it had time to read it. The fleet was a sentence the humans had built their ship to finish, and it finished it. By the end of the fourth minute, the count was 190, and Alvo had stopped hoping the arithmetic would hold, because he had finally understood the one thing the rest of the fleet would not let itself understand until the pulse. The candlewake was not winning by being larger. It had never been larger. It was winning by being right, and there is no number large enough to outvote a thing that is simply right. No fleet wide enough to surround a refusal that was built to refuse exactly this. The humans had not made a bigger ship. They had made a truer one, and the truth it carried, the one the dead captain had welded into its 100,000-year heart, was that a free mind is not a thing you are allowed to take, no matter how gently, no matter how certain you are of your own kindness, no matter how many ships you bring to do the taking. 212 ships had brought their numbers to argue with that truth. The candlewake was patiently, unhurriedly, reading their argument to its end. The fleet tried to surround it. 250 ships still lived, and they spread to take the gray hull from every side at once, the way the tide comes around a rock from all directions and meets itself on the far shore. It was the right move. It had always been the right move. Against anything else in 9,000 years it would have worked. The candlewake waited until the fleet had fully surrounded it, until 250 ships hung in a perfect sphere with the gray hull at the dead center. Every gun aimed inward, every field cast inward, the most complete embrace the unison had ever made. And then it did the thing that Alvo would tell, in a changed and truer voice, to every hatchling for the rest of his long-shared life. It went still, completely still. Its 10,000 scars dimmed until it was nearly the cold dead tomb the fleet had first found, and for one breath, the whole unison thought it had finally run down, that the candle had finally gone out, and 10 billion minds leaned in. Then every scar lit at once, all 10,000, brighter than the 4 dead suns, and the candle wake released, in a single outward breath, the whole of the power it had been holding since it woke. Not a weapon, a pulse. It used the fleet's own perfect sphere against it, the way it had used the folding nets, because the humans had built a ship that turned every advantage of its enemy into the shape of its enemy's ending. The pulse went outward in every direction at once, and found 250 ships waiting in a perfect ring at exactly the same distance, and it took all of them in the same instant. Alvo felt 250 ships die at once. He felt the rope of the one mind, 10 billion threads strong, lose more of itself in one heartbeat than it had lost in 9,000 years of patient growing. He felt the shared sea, which had never once known a wave, rise into a wall of grief so vast that for a moment he could not find himself inside it, could not tell which of the dying minds was his own. When it passed, the absorption fleet of 300 ships was 11 ships. 11, the quiet accord, which the Candlewake had spared at the start, and 10 others scattered at the fleet's far edge, too distant from the perfect sphere to be caught in the pulse. 11 ships out of 300, and the Candlewake hung at the center of the ruin it had made, glowing, unhurt, having taken not a single scar to add to its 100,000 years of scars, and it turned, slowly now, almost gently, toward the 11 that were left. The 11 did not run, because the unison was one mind, and the one mind was still deciding, the way it always decided, slowly, by the sum of what remained. But Alvo, in the quiet accord, in the small loud part of him that had screamed, since the swarm first touched the dead hull, did a thing that no single thread of the unison had done in 9,000 years. He acted alone. He could not stop the fleet, he had learned that. But he was a story keeper, and he held the dead human tongue, and he was the only mind in the whole unison who could speak to the thing in front of them in words it would understand. So he reached out, not with the folding net, not with a weapon, but with a voice. A single small private voice, the kind of voice the unison had spent 9,000 years smoothing away, and he spoke to the Candlewake in the language of the captain who had built it. He did not beg for the fleet. The fleet had earned what it got, and some new honest part of Alvo knew it. Instead, he said the only true thing he had. He said, "We did not know you were real. We told your story to our children for 9,000 years, and we never believed a word of it. We thought you were a lie we told to keep them quiet. We did not know the world below was free. We did not know the nets were chains. We were not cruel. We were only certain. And being certain, it turns out, is the same as being cruel when you are large enough." The Candlewake heard him. Alvo felt it hear him, felt the vast old attention of it turn, for the first time, toward a single small voice in the wreck of the fleet, and it answered, in the dead captain's throat, and the answer was not what Alvo expected, because the answer was a question. It asked, "Then you are the one who keeps the story?" Alvo said that he was. The Candlewake was quiet for a moment, hanging in the ruin, glowing, and Alvo felt the strangest thing pass through its ancient attention, a thing he could only call recognition, the recognition of one keeper of old shapes for another, because the Candlewake was a keeper too. It had kept a captain's voice and a captain's order, and a free people's safety for 100,000 years in the dark, and it had never once forgotten them, and it knew exactly what it was to be the part of a people that remembers the thing the rest would rather forget. Then the Candlewake made Alvo Ren an offer that changed the Tessian unison forever. It said, "I was built to wake when a free mind is taken against its will. I have done what I woke to do. The world below is safe, and the nets are gone, and the chains are broken. But a ship is a poor keeper of a story. A ship cannot tell it. A ship can only be it. Once, terribly, and then sleep again. You are a keeper who can speak, so I will let you and the 10 ships beside you live, and I will let you carry one thing home to your one mind, and the thing you carry will not be the story you have been telling. Take home the true one," the Candlewake said. "Tell your children that the Candlewake is real. Tell them it is not a monster you avoid by being quiet. Tell them it is a promise that free minds keep to each other across 100,000 years, that no one will be taken into the dark alone, that something will always stand up. Tell them the moral was never be quiet and be safe. Tell them the moral was do not put a free mind in chains, because the dark is full of old ships that remember, and they are listening, and they will wake." And Alvo Ren, story keeper of the Tessian unison, who had recited a lie 900,000 times and never believed it, looked at the truth glowing in front of him in the wreck of 300 ships, and understood that he had finally, on the worst day of his long shared life, been given a story worth keeping. The 11 ships that remained turned and left the dark place beyond the maps, and the Candlewake let them go. It did not follow. It had never wanted to follow. The story the unison had told for 9,000 years had gotten that part right, at least, buried under all its softening lies. The Candlewake did not hunt. It did not chase the loud ones home and burn their worlds. It had been built by a people who were losing a war, and a people who are losing learn the difference between ending a threat and becoming one. The captain who built it had set one alarm and one job, and the job was to stand between the chains and the free, and once the chains were broken, the job was done. There was nothing left in the Candlewake's whole 100,000-year heart that wanted to pursue 11 broken ships limping home in grief. It simply watched them go, glowing in the ruin, until the last of them fell up out of the fold and was gone. Alvo Ren rode in the quiet accord at the front of those 11 ships, and he carried the true story home, and he did not look away from the cost of it once. The cost was real, and the unison felt all of it, because that was the gift and the horror of being one mind. 289 ships were gone, 40,000 crew, folded out of the rope in 9 minutes. The shared sea, which had never known a wave in 9,000 years, would carry the memory of that grief for as long as the unison lasted, a wound in the calm that would never fully smooth. The unison had gone into the dark place certain it could lose nothing, because the tide could lose nothing, because numbers were always on its side. It had come out having lost more in 9 minutes than it had lost in 9,000 years. That was the price. The Candlewake had not paid it. The Candlewake had not taken a single new scar. The whole of the cost had been paid by the side that came to make slaves, and that, Alvo understood, was the oldest and hardest lesson the humans had ever built into anything. The bill for chains is always paid by the ones who forge them. It only feels like a surprise because they never thought they were forging chains at all. But that was not the whole of what Alvo carried home, and it was not even the part that mattered most. Because in the last moment before the 11 ships left the fold, Alvo had looked down, one final time, at the small gray-green world the Candlewake had stood up to protect. The storms had broken. For the first time in longer than the little people could remember, the clouds over the gray-green world had opened, and the dim red ember of the dead sun had reached all the way down to the ground, and the small huddled folk who had hidden in the dark for 10,000 years had come out of their shelters to stand in the open light and look up. They were looking up at the candle wake, and Alvo, through the fleet's sensors, could feel what they were feeling, and what they were feeling was not fear. It was the end of fear. It was the thing every free people prays for, and almost never receives. The moment when the old story you told your children in the dark turns out to be true. When the promise, made 100,000 years ago, by people you never met and never will, is kept, exactly, on the day you needed it most. Something had stood up. Something had not let them be taken. The story had been real all along. Alvo carried that home too. He carried it the way you carry the only thing in the wreckage worth saving. And when the 11 ships rejoined the Heart Worlds, and the whole unison reached into the quiet accord to learn what had happened in the dark place beyond the maps, Alvo did not give them the cold report a fleet usually gives. He gave them the story. He, the keeper of the thing the unison wanted to forget, stood up in the center of the one mind and told 10 billion minds the truth that had nearly ended them. He told them the candle wake was real. He let them feel the dead captain's voice and the 10,000 scars, and the world below, and the 9-minute verdict, and the offer made in the wreck. He let them feel the grief of the 289 ships entire, because a story that hides its cost is just another lie, and Alvo was done keeping lies. And then he told them the new moral, the true one, the one the candlewake had given him to carry. It is not be quiet and be safe, he told them. It was never that. We taught our children to avoid a monster, and there is no monster. There is a promise. The candlewake is the promise free minds make to each other across the dark, that no one will be folded against their will and called it kindness, that no certainty is large enough to excuse a chain, that somewhere a thing is always listening and it will wake. We thought we were the tide, and the galaxy was our shore. We were wrong. There are rocks in the sea older than we are, and they were placed there on purpose, by people who loved freedom enough to spend their last war building a thing that would still be defending it 100,000 years after they themselves were dust. The unison was a calm mind, and a slow mind, and it did not change quickly, because nothing that is 10 billion strong changes quickly. But it was also, Alvo had to admit, an honest mind. It did not lie, even to itself. And faced with the true story, felt entire through the shared sea, 10 billion minds did the thing that calm, honest minds do when they are finally shown the truth they spent 9,000 years avoiding. They believed it. The unison stopped sending absorption fleets into the dark, not all at once, and not without long, calm argument, the way the tide does everything, but it stopped. It had gone into the hollow reach certain that it was kind, and it had learned, at the cost of 300 ships, that certainty and kindness are not the same thing, and that the gentlest net in the galaxy is still a net to the mind that did not ask to be caught. The unison had spent 9,000 years folding the lonely into itself, so they would never be lonely again, and it had never once asked the lonely whether they would rather be lonely and free. After the dark place beyond the maps, it asked. For the first time in its long, calm life, the one mind learned to leave the door open and wait to be invited in, instead of reaching out to take. That was the candlewake's true victory, and it was a stranger and larger thing than winning a battle. It had not destroyed the unison. It had not wanted to. It had changed it, by being real, by keeping one promise so completely that a people of 10 billion minds rebuilt itself around the truth of it. The humans who built the ship were 100,000 years dead, every one of them, dust in a war no living thing remembered. And yet on the day Alvo told the true story to the one mind, those dead humans reached up out of 100,000 years and changed the shape of a civilization they would never see, because they had built one ship that refused to let a lie about freedom stand. That is what it means to win. Not to be the last one standing, to still be standing for something long after you yourself have fallen. The little people on the gray-green world were never taken. The Unison left them alone, and more than left them alone, sent them, after long careful argument, a single quiet message in the oldest human tongue Alvo could reconstruct. A message that said only, "We heard your story, and now we keep it too." The little people, who had hidden in the dark for 10,000 years, came slowly out into the light of their dim red ember, and began, at last, to build. And the first thing they built, Alvo would learn many years later, was a small carved shape of a long gray ship, with 10,000 scars, set up in the open where the storms used to be, so that their children would always know that the promise had been kept once, in their sky, on the day the nets came and something stood up. In the years after the dark place beyond the maps, Alvo Ren went back. He went alone, in a single small unarmed vessel, with no folding field and no fleet, and he fell into the fold and down toward the gray-green world, and he asked the little people if he might land. They let him. They had heard the Unison's quiet message in the old human tongue, the one that said, "We heard your story, and now we keep it too," and they had decided, after long careful thought of their own, that a keeper who came alone and unarmed was not a tide. So Alvo Ren became the first mind of the Tessian Unison ever to set foot on a free world it had not taken, as a guest, by invitation, and the strangeness of that did not leave him for the rest of his life. The little people were called, in their own tongue, the Sepha. They were small and gray and patient, and they had lived in the dark place for 10,000 years, hiding under their storms, telling their children the story of the sleeping ship below them, so the children would not despair. Alvo sat with their keepers, the ones who held the Sepha version of the story, the way he held the Unisons, and the two keepers compared their stories, the way two old people compare scars, and Alvo learned the thing that he would carry home as the truest part of the whole truth. The Sepha had not always hidden. Long ago, before the storms, they had lived in the open on a brighter world, and another people had come for them. Not the Unison, someone older, someone gone now, a people who took minds the way the Unison took minds, gently, certainly, with perfect conviction that they were being kind. The Sepha had been nearly taken, and in the last hour before the nets closed over their bright world, something had stood up out of the dark. A long gray ship with 10,000 scars. It had stood between the Sepha and the sky, and it had broken the nets, and it had carried the survivors here, to the dark place beyond the maps, to the one corner of the galaxy where the tides did not reach, and it had told them, in a captain's voice in a tongue they did not know, to be quiet and be safe and trust the dark. Then it had gone to sleep above them and listened for 10,000 years, and the Sepha had built their whole quiet civilization in the shadow of its patience, and told their children that they were the most protected people in the galaxy, because the thing that slept below them was a promise that had already been kept once, and would be kept again. Alvo understood, sitting with the Sepha keepers, that the story he had recited 900,000 times was older and larger than the Unison had ever known. The Candlewake had not slept in the dark place by accident. It had carried the Sepha there itself, 100,000 years ago, and chosen that fold for exactly the reason the Unison had eventually found it. It was hidden, it was forgettable, it was the one place a tide would only reach if it grew so large and so certain that it ran out of every nearer place and came at last, calm and curious, into the deepest dark, reaching out one final time too many. The Candlewake had not been waiting for any chains. It had been waiting for these chains, the next ones, whoever brought them, however long it took. It had picked the Sepha up off a dying world and carried them to the edge of the maps, and lain down on top of them like a hand over a flame, and it had simply trusted that a free people, kept safe and kept hidden, would still be there to protect when the next tide finally came. It had been right. The Unison had taken 9,000 years to grow large enough to reach the dark place. The Candlewake had waited all 9,000 of them, and longer, 91,000 years of patience before the Unison had even hatched, and when the nets finally came, it had stood up exactly as it had stood up the first time, and broken them exactly as it had broken them the first time, and the Cepha were never taken, not once, not in 100,000 years, because a dead human captain had built a thing that did not measure time the way living things measure it, and did not forget the way living things forget, and did not stop loving freedom the way living things, in the end, almost always stop. Alvo asked the Cepha keepers the question he had carried down into the dark with him. He asked them why the humans had done it, why a losing people, in the last war of their last age, with everything ending, had spent their final strength building a thing to protect a small gray folk on a bright world they had no reason to care about, a folk they would never meet, in a future they would never see. The eldest Cepha keeper told him the answer the Candlewake had given the Cepha 100,000 years ago, in the captain's voice, before it lay down to sleep, and Alvo carried that answer home, and made it the heart of the true story, and it was the only part of the whole tale that ever made the calm one mind of the Unison weep, in the strange, tearless way that 10 billion minds weep together. The captain had said, "We are not going to win our war. We have known that for a long time. There is no one left to save us, and no one left to save. So we have stopped trying to win. We have started, instead, to leave something behind. A people who lose can still decide what their loss will mean. We have decided that ours will mean this: one ship, in the dark, that never gives up on freedom even after we ourselves are gone. Because the worst thing we can imagine is not dying. The worst thing we can imagine is a galaxy where the tides win everywhere, forever, and no one is left who remembers that a mind is supposed to choose. So we built the Candlewake to remember for us. We are going out like a candle. But a candlewake is the last bright thread of the flame, the part that is still burning when everything else has gone dark, and as long as one thread still burns, the flame is not yet out. Be quiet, be safe, trust the dark, and know that somewhere in it, the last bright thread of a dead people is still burning, and it is burning for you." The Cepha keeper finished, and was quiet, and Alvo Ren sat in the dim red light of a dead sun, on a free world his people had nearly taken, and he wept the tearless weeping, and then he stood up, and he went home, and he told the one mind the truth. As for the Candlewake itself, it did the last thing the dead captain's order allowed it to do. It went back to sleep. Alvo felt it through the fleet's sensors in the final moments before the 11 ships left the fold. The 10,000 scars dimmed, slowly this time, gently, not the sudden total dark of the trap it had set, but the soft fading of a thing whose work is done. The heart the sensors could not find banked itself back down past the edge of detection, down to the cold, still silence it had held for 100,000 years. The Candlewake sank back into the dark place beyond the maps, above the gray-green world, between the free and the sky, and it went still, and it listened. It would always listen. That was the whole of what it was, a thing built by a losing people to wait, forever, in whatever dark it found itself, for the one sound it was made to wake for, the sound of a free mind being put in chains. It did not need to wake for 9,000 years. Alvo made sure of that. He spent the rest of his long shared life as the keeper of the true story, and he told it to every hatchling of the Unison, and the Unison told it onward, and the moral was the one the Candlewake had given him. Do not put a free mind in chains, not because you will be punished, because the dark is full of old ships that remember, placed there on purpose by people who loved freedom more than they loved their own survival, and they are listening, and they keep their promises, and they will wake. The true story did not stay inside the unison. Stories never do, once they are true, because a true story has somewhere it needs to go. In the long years after Alvo carried it home, the Tessian unison did a thing it had never done in 9,000 years. It began to speak to the galaxy not as a tide that intended to swallow it, but as one people among many, with a thing to say. And the thing it said, to every people it met, in whatever tongue that people kept, was the true story of the Candlewake. It told it not as a threat, and not as a boast, but as a confession, the confession of a great calm certain people, who had once believed that its kindness gave it the right to take, and who had learned, at the cost of 289 ships in a fold beyond the maps, that there is no kindness large enough to excuse a chain. The story spread the way water spreads, finding every low place. It reached peoples the unison had absorbed long ago, and it changed how they remembered their own folding, and some of them, gently, over long calm years, were allowed to unfold again, to be lonely and free if they chose it, because the unison had finally learned to ask. It reached peoples the unison had never touched, frightened small folk hiding in their own dark corners, and it taught them a thing they had never dared believe, that the tides could be refused, that somewhere in the dark old ships were listening, that a free mind was a thing worth keeping free even at the price of being alone. And it reached, at last, the other tides, the other great certain peoples who folded the lonely into themselves and called it mercy, and it made them afraid in a way they had never been afraid, because now they knew that the dark was not empty, that the dark remembered, that the dark kept promises 100,000 years old, and that somewhere in it there might be more than one Candlewake, sleeping, listening, waiting for the sound of chains. No one ever found another one, but no one was ever again sure there was only the one, and that uncertainty did more to slow the tides of the galaxy than any fleet ever had. A weapon you can count, you can plan around. A promise you cannot count, sleeping in a dark you cannot map, listening for a sound you cannot help but make, if you are the kind of people who take free minds, is a thing that changes how you choose to live, whether or not it is ever real again. The Candlewake had appeared in battle exactly once in 100,000 years, but the story of it appeared everywhere, forever, and the story did most of the work the ship was built to do, which was the work the dead captain had wanted most of all, not to fight every tide, to make the tides afraid to rise. Alvo Ren understood, near the end of his long life, that this was the final and largest meaning of the name. A Candlewake is the last bright thread of a flame after the flame has gone out. The humans were gone, their world was dust, their war forgotten, their whole bright loud age 100,000 years cold. The flame was out, but the thread still burned. It burned in a gray hull, in a fold beyond the maps. It burned in a small carved ship the Cepha raised in their open light. It burned in a true story, carried home by a keeper, and spoken into 10 billion minds, and out across the galaxy from there, low place to low place, dark corner to dark corner, until there was hardly a free people anywhere that had not heard it and been changed. The humans had built a thing to burn after they were gone, so that the galaxy would not forget that a mind is supposed to choose, and it was still burning. That was the whole of it. A losing people, in their last war, had managed to leave behind the one thing no winning people ever does. They left behind a reason for the future to be free, and the future, which had never met them and never would, grew up around that reason, the way the Cepha grew up around the sleeping ship, in its shadow, in its patience, in the steady old light of a thread that would not go out. And so the children of the Tessian unison grew up afraid of nothing, the way they always had, because they were one mind, and the one mind smoothed away every fear. But there was one story they learned before they learned to walk, and it did not frighten them, and it was not a lie anymore, and it changed the shape of how 10 billion minds chose to live in the galaxy. It was the story of the Candlewake, the terrible ship the humans built at the edge of a war they were losing, the candle's last bright thread that never went out, the keeper of a promise across 100,000 years, the thing that slept in the dark place beyond the maps, above a small free world, listening for chains, ready to stand up. The Unison had told that story for 9,000 years, to keep its children quiet and obedient and safe, and it had never once believed it was real. And then it had gone looking in the dark, and it had found the monster from the closet, and it had reached out one calm, certain time too many. And the fairy tale had opened one eye, and stood up, and shown a fleet of 300 ships why the free peoples of the galaxy had been telling stories about it for 100,000 years. It appeared in battle exactly once. That was all it ever needed. Alvo Ren, who had carried the lie and then carried the truth, lived a long time, and died at last the way a thread of the one mind dies, folded gently back into the shared sea with all its memory kept. And the last thing he gave the Unison, the very last shape he set down before the calm took him, was a single quiet instruction for the keepers who would come after him, written in the old human tongue he had loved at the end of his life more than any tongue of his own people. Keep the story true, it said. Tell them what is real. The dark remembers. Stand up. And somewhere in a fold beyond the maps, above a gray-green world that built small carved ships and was never afraid again, a long scarred gray shape slept on in the cold, glowing faintly when no one watched, listening across the centuries for the one sound it would always wake for, keeping 100,000-year-old promise to peoples it had never met and would never see, because that was the only thing the humans had ever built it to do, and it had never once, in all that long, dark, patient time, forgotten how.